The captain's voice cut through the cabin. "We're making an emergency landing." Both engines had failed. 31,000 feet in the air. Panic spread instantly. But then a quiet passenger stood up, and what happened next, no one on board could have imagined. The captain's voice cut through the air. "We're making an emergency landing." It wasn't turbulence. It wasn't routine. Both engines on Flight 892 were in trouble, 31,000 feet above ground. In the cockpit, Captain Janet Bradley froze for a fraction of a second. A deep metallic bang had come from the port engine, followed by a violent shudder. Warning lights exploded across her control panel. First Officer Derek Walsh's grip on the controls tightened. "What was that?" he demanded, eyes darting between failing instruments. Janet pressed the intercom. Her voice was calm, too calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a mechanical issue and will be making an emergency landing in Denver. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions." She didn't say they'd lost their main hydraulic system or that the second engine's temperature was spiking dangerously. In seat 12C, retired Air Force Colonel Glenn Hartwell stopped reading his worn paperback. At 71, he knew the difference between a minor glitch and a deadly problem. This was deadly. The unnatural vibrations, the captain's measured tone, they told him everything he needed to know. 3 rows ahead, Diane Carpenter held her daughter Emma's small hand. It was Emma's first flight, a birthday trip. The little girl's wide eyes searched her mother's face. "Mommy, what's happening?" Diane forced a smile. "Just a little airplane hiccup, baby. The pilot knows what she's doing." But the truth? The plane wasn't right. Passengers were whispering, some crying, a man praying aloud. Fear was no longer creeping through the cabin. It was spreading fast. The starboard engine's temperature shot past safe limits. Altitude was dropping fast. Hydraulic pressure was slipping away, and every passing second made the aircraft harder to control. Through her headset, Janet heard air traffic control diverting other flights. They were clearing a path, not for a safe landing, but for what could turn into a debris field. Then came the call. "Flight 892, there's a small regional airport at Pine Valley, bearing 270, 15 miles out. Runway length 4,800 feet. Janet's stomach tightened. A Boeing 737 needed at least 6,000 under normal conditions. With no engines and failing hydraulics, that strip might as well have been a postage stamp. Before she could answer, there was a knock at the cockpit door. A voice followed, steady, authoritative. "Captain, I'm Colonel Glenn Hartwell, retired Air Force. I'd like to help." She glanced at Derek. He didn't speak, but his eyes said it all. They were running out of options. When Glenn stepped inside, he carried himself like someone who had stared down disaster before. Silver-haired, calm, his gaze swept over the failing instruments with the ease of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. The chaos around him didn't seem to touch him. Glenn didn't waste a second. "How long since you lost the first engine?" 8 minutes, Janet replied. "The second's running hot and losing power." He nodded once. "Hydraulics?" "About 20% left." Glenn's voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. "I flew F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, then 30 years as a test pilot. I've landed jets with no power before, but nothing this heavy." Janet hesitated. Everything in her training screamed that passengers didn't belong in the cockpit, but everything in her gut told her normal rules stopped applying the moment they lost that first engine. "Pine Valley's runway is short," Glenn said, scanning the terrain on the radar. "But there's one thing in our favor. It ends at the base of a mountain. If we overshoot, the slope could act as a natural backstop." Derek cut in blunt. "If we overshoot, we die." Glenn's reply was just as blunt. "If we don't try, we definitely die." He leaned closer to Janet. "You need to think like a glider pilot now. One chance at the approach. No go-arounds. No second tries." Out in the cabin, Flight Attendant Carol Williams fought to maintain control as the fear boiled over. Passengers clutched armrests, some sobbing, others frozen in silence. The aircraft's shuddering had worsened, and the steady drop in altitude was impossible to ignore. Glenn kept his focus on the instruments, but his presence was already changing the room. He didn't look like a man facing a crash. He looked like someone already working on the way out. Glenn's eyes locked on the fuel gauges. We need to lose weight and altitude. Fast. That fuel is just dead weight now. Janet's hand froze above the controls. Dumping fuel with both engines out? That's against every protocol I've ever learned. Glenn didn't flinch. Every pound we keep makes this harder. Those people back there are counting on us to make the hard choices. You know that. She thought of the terrified passengers. Diane and her little girl in row 9, the elderly couple holding hands, the businessman who had barely looked up from his phone earlier. All of them were relying on her to get them down alive. Her voice was barely above a whisper. This goes against everything I've been taught. Sometimes survival does, Glenn replied. She took a breath, reached for the switches, and activated the fuel dump. Outside, shimmering trails streamed from the wings. In the cabin, heads turned toward the windows. Murmurs erupted. "Mom, why is the plane leaking?" Emma asked, her small voice trembling. Her mother pulled her close, unable to answer. The fear was no longer just in the air. It was visible. Back in the cockpit, Glenn was already mapping their only hope. Pine Valley's a tight strip surrounded by peaks. If we're coming in, it's got to be perfect the first time. I'll talk you through the setup. 2 o'clock, about 8 miles. Glenn pointed to the windscreen. Janet saw it. A thin strip of asphalt carved into the mountainside. From here, it looked impossibly small. ATC came through the headset. Flight 892, you're cleared for any runway, any approach. Emergency crews are standing by. What they didn't say, and Janet knew, was that those crews were waiting for wreckage, not survivors. Glenn's eyes flicked to the altimeter, then the airspeed. His mental calculations were fast and precise. We're coming in too high and too fast. We need to slip her. Janet stared at him. A slip? In a 737? If I get it wrong, we stall and crash. Glenn's voice cut through her hesitation. If we don't try, we crash anyway. You have the skill. You just need the nerve to use it. Her mind flashed to the faces in the cabin. Emma clinging to her mother, the silent elderly couple, every passenger trusting her without knowing how close they were to disaster. She gripped the controls. Left rudder, right aileron. The aircraft groaned in protest, warning alarms blaring. For a moment, she felt the sickening drop of a stall creeping in, but then it stabilized. Altitude and speed bled away fast. The runway grew larger in the windshield, no longer a distant thread, but a real, reachable target. Glenn gave a faint nod. Beautiful. Now straighten her out. We're committed. Janet's pulse hammered in her ears. There would be no second try. This approach would either save 147 lives or end them all. The runway rushed toward them. Airspeed 180. Derek called out, 40 knots too fast. There was no room left to bleed off more speed. Hold steady, Glenn said quietly. Let her settle. Janet tried to flare the aircraft, but with minimal hydraulics. The controls fought her. The Boeing 737 slammed down hard, the impact rattling every bolt in the frame. Gasps and screams erupted from the cabin, but they were down. For a second, Janet almost allowed herself to believe they'd made it, until the reality hit. No engines meant no reverse thrust. Weak hydraulics meant minimal braking. The plane hurtled down the short strip, tires screaming against asphalt. The end of the runway, and the mountain beyond it, was coming fast. Maximum brakes, Glenn ordered. Janet pressed the pedals with everything she had, the aircraft shuddering violently. Smoke poured from the tires, but the speed was barely dropping. They were going to overshoot. Then Glenn did something no commercial pilot would ever dare in flight. He reached over and yanked the emergency brake handle, a system meant only for ground use, never at this speed. The aircraft lurched as if it had slammed into a wall. Passengers were thrown against seat belts, shouts filling the cabin. The deceleration was brutal, but it was working. 50 feet before the runway's end, the jet groaned to a stop. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was a metallic ticking of cooling engines and the faint wail of approaching sirens. Janet's hands trembled on the controls. She turned to Glenn, who sat back in his seat, breathing hard but steady. Without a word, she reached for the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are preparing for evacuation." The last passenger slid down the evacuation chute, but Glenn stayed in his seat for a moment, catching his breath. Through the cockpit window, he spotted a familiar figure standing near an ambulance, tall, in a naval uniform, eyes locked on the aircraft. Commander Russell Hartwell. His son. They hadn't spoken in 5 years. A bitter argument about duty, family, and words that could never be taken back had left a silence between them longer than either cared to admit. Glenn had been flying to his son's change of command ceremony, hoping for one last chance to fix what had been broken. Now, fate had forced that meeting onto a mountain runway. When Glenn finally stepped onto the tarmac, Russell was there, waiting. "Dad," he said quietly. "Son." For a moment, neither moved. Two men who had spent their lives serving others, but failed to serve their own relationship, just stood there. Then Russell spoke again, his voice cracking. "I heard what you did up there. The whole crew is talking about it." Glenn shrugged. "I just helped the pilot. She did the real work." Russell shook his head. "I've been trying to call you for months about Mom's anniversary, about the ceremony, about a lot of things. I've been an idiot." Glenn felt something in his chest loosen, a weight he'd carried for years. "We've both been idiots, son." The hug that followed wasn't just a reunion. It became the defining image of what news outlets were already calling the Pine Valley miracle. Cameras flashed, capturing not only the survival of 147 souls, but the healing of father and son who'd nearly lost more than life itself. Janet would later tell reporters Glenn was the real hero. Glenn, as always, would insist it was her. The investigation's report was blunt. A hidden manufacturing defect had triggered the first engine's failure, setting off a hydraulic loss that nearly doomed Flight 892. Statistically, their odds of survival had been less than 10%. Glenn knew better than to call it luck. It had been physics, skill, and hard choices made in seconds. Still, he couldn't ignore one truth. Sometimes life puts you exactly where you're meant to be, even if you never planned to be there. 6 months later, Glenn stood before a crowd at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Rows of young cadets sat in crisp uniforms, their futures just beginning. In the front row, his grandson, Russell's son, waited to receive his wings. Glenn looked out at their faces, seeing ambition, fear, and hope all at once. He thought about that day in the sky, about second chances, about how the most important flights aren't always the ones on your schedule. Sometimes, they're the ones that find you when you're needed most.